So folks are trickling into the room. All right, as that number continues to rise. Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Bryant Blunt. I'm an Assistant Dean in the Office of the Dean of Undergraduate Students, ODUS. On behalf of ODUS, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's focus program, the Black Scientific Renaissance at Bell Labs, focusing on the decades spanning from 1970 to the 1990s. Focus is an interdisciplinary initiative designed to bring anti-racist scholarship, thought, and action to every part of university life. And we are extremely excited to spotlight this important and often overlooked area of underrepresentation: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM. In a moment, I'll introduce our panelists who have had distinguished careers, share meaningful ties to Princeton and one another, and have combined to have a profound impact on generations of scholarship industry, and most importantly, people. As champions of mentoring and leadership during their careers, they have been at the forefront of what we now know colloquially as diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Through today's conversation, they'll explore a transformational initiative and the lessons learned in creating meaningful pathways for underrepresented minorities. Given our primary audience, many of the people who will appear in this story are Princetonians, but they're just a fraction of the community that's been lifted by the Bell Labs Fellowship, its founders, and those individuals subsequently inspired by its mission. Following the talk will come a Q&A session, so please submit any questions using that function in Zoom. Now for the introductions. Professor James West is a professor of electrical and computer engineering and mechanical engineering at Johns Hopkins University. He worked at Bell Labs for 40 years before joining the faculty at Johns Hopkins. And while employed at Bell, he co-invented the foil-electric microphone, which is used in almost every recording device today. But West also paved the way for a whole other generation of Black scientists and engineers through mentorship and guidance. He was awarded an honorary degree at Princeton's 2014 commencement for his achievements. Professor Bill Massey is the first Black tenured professor of mathematics in the Ivy League and an alumnus of the Bell Labs Fellowship Program. He was one of James West's mentees. After his distinguished career at Bell Labs, he took the Edwin S. Wilsey Professorship in the Department of Operations Research and Financial Engineering here at Princeton. He has built on Professor West's tradition of mentorship by co-founding and running the Wesley L. Harris Scientific Society, which works to increase the number of STEM students of color and to provide them with mentorship and career development resources. And now I'll turn it over to our presenters.
Okay, thank you, Bryant. What I'll do is do a share screen. Just show you a couple of slides from past. This is from 10 years ago, where I teamed up with Bill Wilson, who's at Harvard, and we put together symposium in honor of Jim West's 80th birthday. That was 10 years ago. So, so now he's turned 90. And this just kind of gives you, this is the tip of the iceberg of all the things he's done in his career. Behind the text, you'll see the faint outlines, what's called a foil-electric microphone, but we'll probably talk about that in another segment. You know, well, what went on, that was stuff he did before the 1970s. And later, he's now at Johns Hopkins. That's something that occurred after the 1990s. That's something we'll also talk about later. You know, because you really do try to innovate and come up with new devices. And then after you come with these devices, you try to make them marketable. So things we'll talk about in the future. But For now, we'll just focus on these 3 decades. And first we'll start with the 1970s, because there's a fellowship program that Bell Labs had started thanks to the efforts of Jim West and the other handful of Black scientists who were there at the time. He sort of laid the groundwork on how you do this. Step 1, when you're at your company, you distinguish yourself technically. And so by doing that, you show the relevance of Black scientists to the development of science. And then you leverage that to say you should be bringing in more Black scientists, in effect, make it a more diverse place for scientific thinking. And there was what's called the CRFP, or the Cooperative Research Fellowship Program. And that paid for the PhDs of many future Black scientists. And a lot of these future Black scientists came from Princeton University. So I'll just, for the 70s, I'll mention 2 recipients. One is James Wayne Hunt. Unfortunately, he's the late James Wayne Hunt. Sadly, he passed away about a month ago. And he was the first recipient, the first Princeton recipient of the Bell Labs Fellowship Program. This program started in 1972. And he had a PhD in electrical engineering, but I guess sort of historical footnote, that was a time where people interested in computer science would get their degrees. And in fact, something I would probably talk about in a Wesley L. Harris Scientific Society meeting in the future, he teamed up with a fellow named Thomas Zamanski, and they're responsible for what's called the Hunt-Zamanski algorithm. And so it's, you'll find a Wikipedia page that discusses this algorithm and the impact of it 40 years later. But it's sort of in a funny place, because people who know Wayne Hunt didn't really know he did this. And people who are familiar with the Hunt-Zamanski algorithm don't realize that the Hunt of Hunt-Zamanski is an African-American scientist. So after him, so 4 years later, that's when I got the fellowship. Ironically, I didn't meet Wayne until 1981. And so I got my bachelor's from Princeton in mathematics, went to Stanford to get my PhD. That, my graduate training at Stanford was paid for by Bell Laboratories, thanks to this program. And then I decided to join the Math Science Research Center at Bell Labs. So I worked there for like 20 years. I should mention, because when I talk to young students, they, 20 years sounds like a long time. And I tell them, well, wait a minute, I knew people who worked there like Jim, 40 years, 30 years. So when I was there for 20, at the time, I just felt I was just getting started. Yeah. So, and so in 2001, so after the time period we're talking about, that's when I leave Bell Labs, join the faculty here at Princeton. So for right now, that I'll just stop there, and because that's the 70s, and just talk to Jim about recollections of the 70s. For you, this is post the electric microphone. I guess in the late 60s, you and other scientists and Bell Labs employees created ABLE. And so what did you feel was happening at the beginning of the 70s?
Good question, Bill, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. The 70s were at Bell Labs was a real interesting period. Interesting because we formed an organization called ABLE, the Association of Black Laboratory Employees. And the main purpose of this organization was to improve the quality of life for everyone. Equally, we wanted to improve diversity in STEM as well as in other fields. But I'll talk only about excellence in STEM. The group consisted of roughly 7 members of the technical staff who participated in what I'm going to describe now. That number, although large compared to other companies, was still a finite number of individuals as far as we could see at that time. And unfortunately, statistics haven't changed that much. Brown people are 25% of the population, but less than 5% of the STEM workforce. And this is not the way things ought to be. We need to have representation compared to our numbers in the population. The first effort on the part of ABLE was to establish a center of excellence at a historically Black university. But this ran into many, many difficulties that and problems that we couldn't solve, mainly around fiduciary responsibilities and funding. So we discarded that idea and came up with a program called the Cooperative Research Fellowship Program. By the way, all of these programs and the encouragement to look at programs that will improve diversity was a result of a meeting that we had with the board of Bell Labs. And there we asked Bell Labs to hire more underrepresented minority and women scientists. And they turned the tables on us essentially and said, we hired you, find them, and we'll consider. But guess what? They didn't exist. And that was a sad story. And so we went back to the board and said, look, we really appreciate your offer to hire, but we don't have enough in the queue to bring to you to consider to hire. Wouldn't you like to participate in a program that increased this number? And they became very intrigued by that concept and agreed to fund the Corporate Research Fellowship Program, in which 5 to 6 new candidates were funded by the program. And one very important thing, each student had a mentor who was on the faculty, on the staff at Bell Labs, and whenever possible, a graduate of the university that the student planned to attend. And this mentorship, I think, is largely responsible for the small attrition rate that this program had. And so that's kind of the beginning, the genesis of the programs that you will hear more about as we go on.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Of course, you remind me, I think I should mention when you talk about mentorship, that my mentor was James Mckenna, who got his PhD in physics from Princeton University. So it's a big Princeton family that's been involved in the fellowship program from the very beginning. So let me now go through the screen. And let's see where we end up here. Okay, so now we segue from the 70s to the 80s, and you see this the change of the Bell Labs, or the Bell telephone logo into the more familiar AT&T logo. So that was a time of divestiture. And so here were CRFP recipients of the 80s. Lance Collins. Oh, I should mention, this is all the information you have here. If you see a poster behind me, it's a talk I gave like 12 years ago. So this is all 12-year-old information. So yes, he was a chair back then, but later he became the Dean of Engineering at Cornell University. And now you've moved on from there. I guess Jim said you were provost at
CMU,
Virginia.
I think.
Virginia, VCU. So that's Lance Collins. And then Ralph Aldridge. And he got his PhD at the Mechanical Aeronautical Engineering Department here at Princeton. And I should also mention that through knowing Ralph, since he was in the Bell Labs Fellowship Program, I met another Black grad student at the time, so one of his friends, and this was Alec Gallimore, who's currently the Dean of Engineering at the University of Michigan. And there was Arlie Petters. Full disclosure, when I started working at Bell Laboratories, I became Arlie's mentor, in the program. So he got his PhD from MIT, but they had like an exchange program. So he was able to matriculate to Princeton for at least a year while he was working on his dissertation. Then there's Roberto Hernandez. Okay, remember, this is 12-year-old information. He's no longer at Georgia Tech. He actually is at Johns Hopkins right now. So he worked with in chemistry. And okay, so that's the 80s. So, so Jim, so anything else you want to say about what went on in the 80s? The transitions from, I mean, I remember that, I guess with the breakup and of the Bell, of the phone system into breaking up into smaller little pieces, and that we were still a part of AT&T along with Bell Labs, which is now called AT&T Bell Labs. But I remember like development people got more involved in the program. So that resulted in a lot more electrical engineers getting Bell Labs fellowships.
Very true. The 80s were not the most pleasant time at Bell Labs or throughout the system, primarily because Bell Labs existed because AT&T was making more money than, remember, it was a regulated industry at that time. And they spent the money wisely by investing in science and technology, which, and at that time there were roughly 1,000 principal investigators at Bell Labs. But with divestiture, the money went away. And when the money went away, all sorts of strange things began to happen, including efforts to shut the program down. I don't think I would relate it to racism in any way, but more financial. And this resulted in Able having to defend the program again. And I must say that we were able to successfully get this done. And we received, I believe, something like a $30 million endowment to support the program for the foreseeable future.
So thanks, Jim. So let me try this one more time. Okay, so in the 80s, we now go to the 90s, and the red logo is, if you may not recognize it, is the logo for Lucent Technologies. And that was sort of the, I guess in the earlier times, it was Western Electric. That was the part of the company that built the telephone equipment. And then they spun that off to be a separate entity from AT&T. Now, Lucent Technologies was later acquired by Alcatel. And so Bell Labs went, with Lucent, went with Alcatel. That's where we ended up working. And then later, Alcatel was acquired by Nokia. Now, people who were recipients of CRP Fellowship Program, Otis Jennings, and again, full disclosure, Otis was my first senior thesis student in 1994, but that's not when I joined the faculty. It wasn't until 2001. And so part of what makes minority recruiting work is that you have proactive departments. The chairman at the time, Erhan Chinwar, who founded the Operations Research Department at Princeton, he literally had been trying to recruit me for like 20 years before I finally agreed to do it. Okay, so diversity only works when you play a long game. You cultivate, and you just cultivate relationships over that time. And so part of their playing the long game is introducing me to Otis Jennings, still at Bell Labs, and say, would you like to supervise the senior thesis? And I should also mention with Otis, since this is 12-year-old information, he is now working with a company at Princeton, Mathematica, and working with Akira Bell, who's also, I think he's the chief financial officer or information officer. She's a Princeton alum of Bell Labs, of the program at Princeton OR. Abigail Joseph, she has a PhD in computer science, and she's moved on from what she was doing here 12 years ago, but she's still working in the same space. She's been heavily involved in, I think she at once involved in a group called Girls Inc. So she's been heavily involved in computer science programs to encourage more minorities and women to be engaged in computer science fields. And and she's got the right approach. You start when they're young, and try to get them engaged at an early age. Ayanna Holloway, Arcee, she was a physics undergrad here at Princeton, and she's still at Duke University. She's full professor there now, and we grant her a fellowship in 1999. And so now, since I'm showing you Princeton people in the program, what you may not see is the enormous number of CRFP graduates who are in physics. And then the second largest group is probably electrical engineering. So this is a program that dramatically increased the number of Black physicists and Black electrical engineers in the country. And finally, we have Robert Hampshire, who's, this sort of 12-year-old photo. So here he's just posing at graduation with John Nash, I guess the graduate alums at Princeton, find an easy way to bond together. And Robert was my, I had mentored Arlie Petters in the fellowship program. Well, Robert was my last student in the Bell Labs fellowship program, or CRF fellow, because he was going to be my first PhD student at Princeton. So we worked both summer of 2001, we were both working at Bell Labs. And September 2001, we both left Bell Labs to join Princeton University. And since, like I said, 12-year-old information, so I'm not really listing here that aside from being years later becoming a full professor, becoming a associate professor, tenured at the University of Michigan in their School of Public Policy, or the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. He is now the acting Assistant Secretary of Transportation for the Biden administration. This is a new position he just got in January 20th. So that's the 90s. So Jim, what was your feeling about that? Was the time we were going transitioning from the the 80s, we were getting used to all the turmoil of monopoly phone system to divestiture. And then by 1995, we were going through what was called trivestiture. So the smaller company broke up into smaller pieces, and we went with the piece called Lucent Technologies. And so that was, so what we didn't know back then, I guess about 5 years later, we were all probably about to leave. But I remember we had good times trying to keep the program, motivate the program, keeping it going. So what's your feeling about those times?
Well, the lesson that we learned in those days is that you can't take your eye off the ball, because the ball will disappear in the system if you look away just momentarily. And many attempts were made to shut the program down because of the cost of running it. Not only cost in dollars, but cost in manpower, because each of the students in the program, and at any given time, we probably could have had as many as 30 or 40 students in the program at one time. And so this put a tax on 40 members of the technical staff to provide mentorship for these students. And we required visits both ways, the mentor to visit the university and vice versa. And some of the reasons for that are kind of interesting. I was at MIT for a conference and decided to go and visit one of the CRP students in chemistry at MIT, and the secretary didn't even know him, didn't know the student. So I talked to the chair and says, oh yeah, he's here, but he's sitting in biology because we don't have enough room here in chemistry to support him. And this is unacceptable. They would not do that to a student that they're paying. So free students created a bunch of problems that we were not used to, but had to come up with solutions and demand that the corporate research fellows be treated as a normal student. And we were fortunate that most universities did indeed change their position as far as these students are concerned. But we also had the mentors interact for the students. And This was the main positive role that mentors played in the later part of the program.
Okay. So what we do here, I figure, Jim, remind me of one last slide I want to show. Let's see if we. It pops up here. Okay, as we leave the 90s. Okay, here it was. Oh, okay, so speaking of old information, so this is a 20-year-old slide, okay? And what I found was interesting being a researcher, being a mathematician, working at Bell Labs, I had unusual professional experiences because it was a great broadening experience. I got to see, I was not living in a silo. I guess that would be the modern way of describing it. I got to get to befriend people in electrical engineering and physics and computer science. And you know, just seeing the whole different approaches they had to doing research and thinking about things. And then also interacting with the corporate side, I learned a little bit about, you know, marketing. Because I found you can say, oh, there are all these women, there are all these minorities, and they've all got PhDs, and they're all academic professors. And you can just say 60, or, you know, of them, right? But when you put in their hands a visual image of the United States, and you have the numbers, names of those individuals and names of the universities they're at, and then visually you notice there's so many of them you can barely fit them on the page. It's a lot easier to convince people that this program has had some impact. And remember, this is a 20-year-old photo. So imagine how much more impact there is now. I mean, like, so for example, what's not on here? Well, you know, obviously what's not on here is me. I was still at Bell Labs, so I'm not at Princeton yet. But there's also Jennifer Rexford, who is the chair of the CS department here at Princeton. And she was a graduate of the women's program, what's called the GRPW program. And then of course, Robert hadn't even started grad school at this time. So, you know, he's on the faculty at University of Michigan while he's on leave from there to hang out in Washington, DC, working for the Biden administration. So this really gives you a sense of what was set in motion by these programs. And I think now that I am an academic, I just realized how lucky I was to spend my first 20 years working in industry. Because somehow there isn't that, I don't know, collective mission that, you know, gets people collectively doing things like this and making this impact. So I think I'll stop there, and then maybe if Brian, I guess he might want to start.
I'd like to make one additional comment, if I may. And that comment is, when I look back on what was accomplished, essentially by a handful of Black technical people, it behooves me to give a shout out to all of you, no matter where you work. It is a good idea to organize around your brown people. And I say that because in many cases, companies looking for ways to improve diversity, but they don't know how. But we do know how, as an example of the Corporate Research Fellowship Program that we started at Bell Labs. I warn you that this is not easy. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. But when I look back on my life and what I contributed, I'm a very rich person because of all of the people that the program was able to help and make into real scientists. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you both for taking us through the experience. And we actually are getting some questions in the chat. It's good people are dialing in, and maybe for either of you, I think a sort of a response, but maybe an elaboration on your sort of last statement is, someone's asked what advice you might give to Black scientists as they consider careers in either industry or the academy.
You first, Jim.
Well, no, you first.
Well, it depends on the discipline, because I think there are trade-offs. What I liked about industry is like the breadth. I walked in there really understanding how mathematics contributes to the general mission of science and building things. And I think that's what encouraged us, it helped us become more creative, because there was a general mission. Whatever field we're in, we know we're there to make a better phone system. So we have a context to develop a dialogue. And so we communicate. So I got to learn about how, microphones work. Or I learned about, like MOCVD, what those initials actually stand for, what most math people never find out. So that's what I like about the industrial world. Okay, the academic world, it's sort of a mixed bag. What I see in general is that a lot of people, maybe it's because a lot of people go straight from grad school to becoming an academic. And I liken it to growing up in a small town and never leaving. Okay. If you've never left, then you really don't have a perspective on where you are. And they, I find a lot of Black academics, when it comes to issues of diversity, they always have this who me look in their face. Like, I'm supposed to do something? I thought we're supposed to hire an administrator to do it, stuff like that. He said, no, you're supposed to do it. And then why? Because since I got late into the game of being an academic, so once I became one, I said that the compelling argument for being an academic, a Black person becoming academic, is that if you think there's a shortage of Black people in STEM, Black PhDs in STEM, well, who creates the new PhDs in STEM? Okay, it's academic research professors. Okay, so you need more of them, and you need more of them actually engaged in creating more, creating all types of PhDs, but especially Black ones too, because in most cases, there were white professors who took a chance on them as a Black student to get a PhD. So why are you taking a chance on a Black student too?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I fully agree with your view. I'd just like to make a few comments. And the first comment is that Bell Labs was a unique place. There's no place that I know today that in any way equals the opportunities and the openness of Bell Laboratories. Openness meaning that we were encouraged to publish. Today, in major laboratories that are devoted to research, there's a cloak of silence around what the people are doing. And I wanted to put that out there because you need to be aware of the fact that you go to work for Microsoft or for Apple, you can believe that your scientific career will be stalled to a large extent. Not that you don't make progress, not that you don't do good work, but we are known through our publications. And so that made Bell Labs a little unique. And I want to warn you to look at the practices of any company that you plan to join from the standpoint of publishing, because that is the way you get known. If it were not for Bill's publications, he probably would not have been suited by Princeton University, but because he was able to publish and permitted to publish, his work and the quality of his work was well known. My transition into industry, into academia, came rather late in my career. It was because mainly the group that I supported at Bell Labs no longer had customers. I guess that's the best way to put it. So it was pretty clear that either I had to find something else to do or someplace else to work. And so I began to look at universities, to move around and give talks at various universities. And I settled on Hopkins for one major reason, and that it was more like Bell Labs than other universities that I had visited. In what way? In the way at Bell Labs, you couldn't lock your door. If somebody from chemistry, if someone, Bill pointed this out a little bit earlier, someone from materials had a problem that they think you might be a good collaborator, you are free to collaborate with that person. And that's what I look for at a university. And Hopkins is very oriented toward medicine. And this is because of the large hospital that's associated with the university. And because there, at Bell Labs was communications, at Hopkins is medical devices and support for medicine. And this is the reason that I ended up at Johns Hopkins, because of the similarity in the way it worked compared to Bell Labs.
Let me mention one thing. Jim, what reminded me of something that given the interdisciplinary nature of Bell Labs, so I found that leaving there, so I go there as a math, my training's in mathematics, right? But then Bell Labs pulled a trick on me. They turned me into a computer science historian. Okay, and so I can tell you, you hear people talk in computer science, talk about open source coding and things like that. Well, the pioneers of open source was Berkeley Unix, because it was when Bell Labs, they invented the operating system of Unix, they offered it to Berkeley. Hey, take it free of charge, fix it up, add on new things that you want, whatever. Okay, so that just creates this, that I'm sure that helped create the culture of open source programming. And so this is how you really get, new ideas, where people are free to engage and experiment with things. So anyway, Brian?
Thank you for that. Both of those sort of responses. I think that some more questions are coming in the chat. Again, referencing some of the things are linked maybe to some of the things that you've talked about. And actually, I see it, recognize a name, a Princeton alum, Ose. Thank you for joining us today. Ose asks, for both of you, I presume, what has Bell done to acknowledge this legacy, or even more broadly outside of Bell, where are these Black scientific contributions being documented? To archive it, to create a project that helps us know some of this history even you've shared today.
Well, part of the problem is, well, frankly, getting the interests outside of, getting interest outside of Bell Labs itself, or just in the academic world, because I find the academic world is so balkanized. Is like a lot of people in the academic world really have no interest in this issue. Oh yeah, a bunch of Black scientists were at Bell Laboratories, and you don't find, you'll find people in Black studies. Well, I majored in history or English. I didn't major in science, so I don't really care. Or I don't understand it. What does that have to do? What is science, technology, and mathematics? What does all that have to do with Black people? So nobody knows how to connect these things. The lady who wrote Hidden Figures didn't seem to have these hangups. I mean, if there are more people like her around, we'd be in much better shape. For us personally, everyone's always trying to get us to write up more of this stuff, and then we say, well, I'll speak for myself. It's all I can. I'm too busy trying to write up a new book on queuing theory, and I guess I should be writing out these other things too. And then, Jim, you might be distracted by taking one of your new inventions to market, But just getting that interdisciplinary attitude that there is something going on here that should be recorded. And by the way, and to Osei's point, little things I try to do along those lines is, why do you think I lobbied to get Jim West an honorary degree at Princeton? It's just a subtle way of helping to document some of these things. Oh, and let me give a shout out to Jennifer Rexford. She was very helpful also in helping that happen.
Right. I think probably about 6 months before we were all locked down, AT&T had a program that addressed the Black organizations at AT&T. What I found very interesting is that the concept of ABLE has grown, has really exploded into most every niche within the AT&T company. And this program that was basically to honor the founders of ABLE. And I found that very intriguing and very, very interesting. In fact, I made a video that was on CNN for that program. But what most major companies are concerned about today, let me capitulate. Many years ago, I served on a committee for the National Academies. And the topic of that committee was, what role does diversity play in your company? And we petitioned many presidents of and leaders in major companies. And I'll just tell you one story. Ford made the first minivan, but it didn't sell very well until one of the vice president noted that this was being driven mostly by women, but designed by an all-male team. And he put together a very diverse team of designers, which designed the minivan that sold the most, and probably still does. I haven't kept up with those statistics since then. But story after story where diversity counts. Today, it is even more important. And this has a lot to do with the social unrest that is going on, but everyone is looking for Black and brown people for their staff or for their university. I don't know about you, Bill, but even at my age, I still get inquiries about availability. So all of you who are undergraduates and graduates, please continue and optimize your education, because there's no way you won't find a job when you finish.
Maybe we can sort of continue that into the last question, but in a more general way. Someone has asked what you might recommend for, graduate students in, in a given area, for example, financial engineering, to be balanced, to have exposure, to be prepared following their time in the academy, whether they want to continue in the academy or go into practical worlds. What sort of advice would you give them generally to approach?
Well, I think
that's in the world.
Jim had brought this up earlier. Like my 20 years in industry was a setting where I could publish in the outside world. So I had an outside reputation. So I could leverage that to come back to the academic world. So I kind of took the, compared to most academics, they would probably say I took the easy way to become a full professor, because I just spent 20 years doing research at Bell Labs and publishing a lot of papers. And then I just kind of walk into Princeton as a full professor. So, right. So if you want to make sure academic or industrial life is a two-way street, you really have to look at the fine print and see, are you at a place where you're strongly encouraged to publish in the outside world?
I think you said it all, Bill.
And then we just had a couple more minutes, but I guess I'd be curious for your, both of you, or maybe your final thoughts, again, thinking broadly, and something I'm hearing throughout the course of your talk, the program, the decade approach, is that this is a long pipeline, right? This is, Professor West, you talked about how in the beginning there was nothing in it. It was empty. And I guess I'd be curious to hear, in some ways, maybe now it's still in some little light or empty, but hearing from you both, how we might prime it and then keep it flowing into the future so that we can, as you said, reach numbers that mirror our society.
Well, I am not only very proud, but in awe sometimes when I look at what the Association of Black Laboratories was able to achieve. And this is a small group of people that made this happen. I have tried to organize the Black faculty at Johns Hopkins, but I meet with an awful lot of resistance until I begin to tell the story of Abel, until the people understand that even small groups of people can have a tremendous influence and effect on the company that in which you work. In the time since I've been at Hopkins, the Black faculty has probably gone up by an order of magnitude. Now, that's not very many people, because when I got to Hopkins, there were only a handful of us, but that handful, we were able to, without even organizing, to influence the institution to be more attentive at hiring underrepresented minorities and women.
Thank you. Bill, any final thoughts?
Yeah, well, I guess two things came to mind, but I guess it's a part of a TEDx talk I did once, where if I reduce it to a soundbite, I would say is think plural. Okay, and it's not a matter of pointing to some Black person and making them a scientist. It's creating a Black scientific community. You just get people because I think the dialogue in the Black community must broaden, okay? Because I have this sort of humorous summary of the movie Hidden Figures, which is I'm not being that humorous because it's a serious point, but my quick synopsis of the movie is that it's all about change, okay? People have to do something different. So what the movie's telling us that if you're white, you've got to learn how to work with people of other racial and ethnic and religious backgrounds, be able to work with them on common projects and work with people as equals, right? But there's another equally important message in the movie, that the movie was telling us that if you're Black, you have to learn how to program in Fortran. Okay. So I find a lot of Black people like to focus on the first message, but they quietly want to walk around the second message, that we have to do things too, because I see, sometimes I hear a Black professor complaining about how come I'm stuck working with all the Black students, okay? I have never heard a professor of any other ethnic group ever talk like that in public. Okay, so we need to stop saying that in public. Okay, so if we're not interested in working with them, who's going to be interested? Okay.
Yep.
And then I find the problem with the academic culture, it's so balkanized. I guess the word is silos. They used to use the phrase ivory towers, but silos are worse because, at least towers had windows, okay? But,
No windows in silos.
right, and so we came from a culture of interdisciplinary research, okay? And so I've always found common cause with diversity and interdisciplinary research. It's really the same sort of, so silo thinking is deadly for dealing, real life is interdisciplinary, okay? So you've got to be interested in be good at what you do, but also learn how to talk to people in other fields. I think that's the secret to getting more of the outreach. So notice the recurring theme is community building, thinking plural. Ideas get transmitted through communities. It's not just individuals sticking to themselves and not wanting to talk to anybody else.
Yeah, just one point. Bill mentioned Hidden Figures. Well, my mom was one of them.
Right. Hey, Jim, we were going to save that for the first, the next one.
No better teaser for your
right.
Talk.
Yeah,
Well,
teaser for things to come. Right.
But I certainly for this event, thank you both so much. This has been really, I think, really enriching and really rich. And to our attendees, thank you. I'll invite my colleague on in a moment to sort of close us out, but I'm looking forward to continuing to share this information and your lessons with our broader community, Princeton and beyond. So thank you both.
And thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Michael.
Yes, absolutely. As we come to the end of our time today, I want to reiterate Brian's gratitude to you, Professor Massey, and to you as well, Professor West. Thank you for sharing your insights on how equity, diversity, and inclusion lead to more robust scientific progress. From today's conversation, it's clear that Princeton students and those tuning in are eager to engage with and learn more about how racism and prejudice and inequity and difficulty and opportunity manifest in STEM fields. Today's conversation may serve as a starting point for some or a continuation of education for others. Nevertheless, it's critical that we continue having conversations about the role race plays in our lives. Today's was the latest conversation in the focus series hosted by the Office of the Dean of Undergraduate Students, To learn more about the Focus series, please visit the Focus website at otisfocus.princeton.edu. This new web page offers a history of the creation of the Focus series, has recordings and recaps of previous events, and has additional diversity, equity, and inclusion resources, including links to Princeton's broader racial equity commitments, an anti-racism reading list, and Black-owned business partnership information. Thank you again to Professor Massey and Professor West, and we look forward to continuing our education on racial equity at our next Focus event later this month.